Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 23 Let's Play of the Colorado Rockies. This is the first year, the first day of this playthrough here at the beginning of the 2048 to 2049 off season. If you've been watching our OOTP 23 series, we spent 16 years with the Kansas City Royals, followed by 11 years with the Pittsburgh Pirates. And we have moved on to a new challenge with the Colorado Rockies. So this is the first episode of that series. Being the first episode of the series, would absolutely appreciate it if you would like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment down below, let us know any suggestions that you have. Always appreciate the interaction with viewers and would appreciate anything you can do to help others find us in this little corner of the internet and YouTube. So we moved on to Colorado, given that they are a pretty mediocre team with a pretty mediocre financial situation and a pretty mediocre ownership situation and a pretty mediocre farm system. Thought it would be a good challenge. And also, given that I generally try to build teams through pitching, thought that playing in Colorado and either having to figure out a way to win without building a team through pitching or figuring out a way to build a pitching staff that can excel in the thin air and the high elevation of Denver, which leads to a lot of home runs, would be an interesting challenge. So we are here in Colorado, the Rockies coming off of a 75 and 87 season. Taking a quick look at the front office, we are 23rd in baseball in budget, smaller budget than we used to have in Pittsburgh, worse team than we used to have in Pittsburgh. And the ownership situation is not great. Charlie Monfort, still at 88 years old, is the owner of the team here in 2048. He's demanding in terms of his patience, controlling with his fiscal personality, normal involvement, and a balanced priority. So at the age of 88, would expect that he will be either selling the team or someone in his family may be inheriting the team over the next few seasons. So that is also another interesting situation that we're dealing with. Personnel-wise, we actually have openings for a manager and a bench coach, which I didn't know heading in. I didn't spend a lot of time looking at the rosters, looking at the coach situations, looked more at kind of higher level stuff. So it's kind of good that we've got a blank slate from that perspective. Even with the limited number of coaches that we have, team cohesion is only kind of mediocre at this point. Not a lot of guys that work well together, but not a lot of guys that really struggle with one another either. Hopefully we can fix that a little bit as we add some players. Our team trainer is the definition of average, which may be fine. We'll see if there's anybody better out there, and then we are going to look for a new scouting director. Right now we have Dylan Flores, who is excellent with everything, which isn't bad. Obviously, that's excellent to be excellent with everything. But he favors ability and would prefer to pivot, if possible, to a favor tools or, in a perfect situation, a highly favored tools scout who also has some good ability. He's only got 1 year left on his contract, so we will likely be firing Mr. Flores if we can find somebody and bring in someone else on board. And you can see we've also got a lot of openings throughout our farm system. So a little bit more work to do with the coaching staff that I had anticipated. We'll be working on that. Doing some of it offline, but trying to talk through the big decisions here. But the real big decisions are about our roster. And it's actually, in a way, worse than I expected, which is good. It's going to make it more of a challenge. But the salary situation is really ugly because the guys that I would like to get rid of, the guys making the good money here, are either players with no trade clauses and 10 and or 10-5 rights who apparently don't want to go anywhere, or in the case of Jamal Cohen, a player who our owner wants us to sign to an extension. And our owner, even though it is our first day of employment, literally, has already told us that they expect more from us. Next season is very important, and if there's no progress, changes are going to be made that will likely start at the top. So we may have to sign Cohen to an extension. You can see he's been real productive with 47 and 45 homers the last 2 years, but 45 homers this year in a 106 OPS plus. So a little bit above average, but not a ton of value, and kind of figuring out the actual value of players in the numbers they're putting up in Colorado, both offensively and as pitchers, is going to be an interesting challenge for me, and one that I'm looking forward to. So before we start going crazy with the coaching staff and figuring out who our manager and scout, etc., are going to be, going to quickly walk through, might not even be that quick, I'll be honest with you, but we're going to walk through the roster that we've inherited, talk about the strengths and weaknesses of it. In many cases, it seems like they're more weaknesses than strengths. Move to a 6-man rotation just to kind of see who our bench coach, since we don't have a manager at this point, would put in the rotation potentially. And then you can see we've got 19 players. Looks like all 39 players on the 40-man roster are kind of in the decision-making process here, which at least gives us a pretty high-level view of the organization. Obvious thing when we look at the bullpen, you look at all of these bullpen pitchers, and there's only one lefty, Javi Vargas. So that is something we obviously probably will want to work on this coming off season. Taking a look at the starting rotation, Andres Erazari, one of the guys I mentioned, making big money, $21 million each of the next 2 seasons. He says he's not willing to waive his no trade clause. He is a guy that we would definitely like to move on from. 8-9 record last year with a 4.20 ERA, which in Colorado, certainly not unrespectable. 109 ERA plus, 81 FIP minus. But he's 34 years old, going to turn 35 on New Year's Day. He's fragile physically, and he's due $21 million each of the next 2 years. Given that I am inheriting, as I mentioned, a pretty mediocre farm system, and a farm system that right now is not being invested heavily in either scouting or player development, getting rid of the biggest salary on the team in the case of Erazari would be a good thing. Obviously, only 2 seasons left next year in 2049 and then 2050. But would certainly love to clear that money off of the books sooner rather than later. Another pitcher, Stephen Moore. This is a guy who's got some talent. A 25-year-old former first-round draft pick. Spent time with the Rockies each of the last 3 years at this point. Not the greatest stuff in the world, but decent movement and decent control. Power pitcher that throws pretty hard. Think he certainly has a role going forward. Chris Gonzalez, similar situation, 25-year-old, former scouting discovery, decent personality. Started 31 games for the Rockies last year, has been up the last 3 seasons plus, actually the last 3 seasons plus, parts of 4 seasons. Another guy who, a mid-rotation kind of starter potentially. Jordan Medrano, a little older than some of those other guys, heading into an arbitration year, not expected to make a ton of money. Good personality with the captain and the work ethic, ground ball pitcher, decent movement, which you like to see in Colorado. So I don't hate some of these frontline starters. Nelson Escobedo, another one. This is a player, I like his personality. Still making the major league minimum at this point. The thing I don't love about him is that he's an extreme fly ball pitcher who throws in the low 90s. And you can see he gave up 27 home runs in 150 innings pitched. If we have to start him for the next couple years or use him, we would. but a fly ball pitcher who doesn't throw that hard. Excellent movement's going to be important for a player like that. And then Jesus Romero, another guy, 28 years old, a lefty, which we're short of. Looks like he could be a competent back end of the rotation type starter. Looks like the Rockies just picked him up on waivers from the White Sox towards the end of the season. Didn't actually even pitch for Colorado yet. Kind of roster filler, fifth starter kind of guy, but he is a left-handed arm, which we don't have a lot of, as I talked about. Issue with him is that he's signed for the next 3 years, and that contract's going to be up over $11 million in the not-so-distant future. So that would be a reason that we would likely be moving on from him. I will, thankfully, for all of you who are watching, I'm not going to go through all of these relievers one at a time. Just hit a couple key highlights. Willie Sotero is our closer, guy who is going to be arbitration eligible for about $4 million this year. Looks like a pretty average bullpen arm at the major league level. Don't love the fact that he doesn't have great movement. Does have pretty good stamina. He's durable as far as his injury proneness, so he can probably take the ball for us, as often as we need to as a closer. You can see he saved 35 games for the Rockies last year. I don't think he's a long-term member of our organization, though. Dong Ki Choi is a guy who looks like he could start or relieve. Like the fact that he's got a good work ethic, started 31 games for the team last year. He would definitely be in the mix to move into the rotation if we are able to find a way to move on from the likes of Irizarry or Romero or any of the other guys. The issue kind of is, I mentioned, we only have one lefty in the bullpen right now with Javi Vargas. We do have the two lefties in the rotation potentially, but those are also the two pitchers that we are most interested in potentially moving on from, given the salary commitments to them over the next few years. So we're probably going to be looking for some left-handers in this upcoming offseason. We'll check in on the one lefty we have, Javi Vargas. Again, a replacement level-ish type left-handed pitcher. Is a guy who seems like he could start or relieve, which is positive. Taking a look at his ratings, he's a little better against left-handers than he is against right-handers, given that we have such a dearth of southpaws on the team right now. Hard to imagine that he's not going to make the team next year. You can see we've got tons of guys to think about as far as right-handed arms out of the bullpen. A lot of these guys don't have great personalities. The only positive thing is that most of them aren't making very much money, so we should have a lot of flexibility to build the roster the way we like it over the next few years. Not a lot of long-term commitments except for the likes of the contract with Irizarry that we may be stuck with, unfortunately. So overall, I'd say the pitching is okay. I feel like we've got a lot of third, fourth, and fifth starters. Obviously going to have to find people over time that are more front end of the rotation type players. We were 14th in the National League in runs allowed last year, but some of that is obviously based on playing in Colorado. When I look at the talent of the players we have, and again, I don't know how much confidence I have in our scout at this point, because although he is excellent at everything, like I said, he does tend to favor ability rather than favoring tools, which, doesn't necessarily mean that his scouting reports on these established MLB players are wrong. In fact, they could be even more accurate. But when trying to kind of build a team for the future and figure out the potential of some of these younger players, I don't think he's quite as equipped to do that. And also, it's a new relationship virtually between me and him that just started today. I don't necessarily have a ton of confidence in his scouting reports. And as I talked about, it's conceivable that the relationship ends within the next couple of days if I'm able to find someone that I like better to replace him. But before we get into that talk, we're going to take a look at the everyday players. Catcher is a position that ownership has asked us to upgrade. Dennis Fell, kind of the starter last year, love his defensive ability. And he's been the starter for the Rockies for the last 3 years. Just not really a major league hitter, though. Hit 216 this year. 47 OPS plus, 50 WRC plus, and such a bad offensive player that he was a negative WAR despite that excellent catcher ability. Wouldn't mind if he was a backup for us next year with that great defensive nature. The issue is, though, he's starting to make a decent amount of money for a guy who's a negative WAR player despite that great catcher defense. So I can't argue with Mr. Monfort all that much about potentially moving on from him. Alex Ortiz is a youngster who I like a little bit. Looks like a close to average-ish major league bat, potentially. A guy who could be able to at least hold his own in the majors, although he did only hit 209 in AAA this past year. Decent personality and above average catcher ability. So he to me looks like a really nice backup potentially down the line. We also have Ramon Rodriguez on the roster. He's a guy who has 3 option years left. In a perfect world, he'd be a AAA catcher for us next year, although after spending this year in the majors, he probably doesn't want to hear that. Our first baseman, as I talked about, is Jamal Cohen. Management wants us, or ownership wants us to sign him to an extension. Was a number 1 draft pick by the Rockies back in 2037. Had a nice career with the team. Going to be turning 30 years old in about a month. Good personality. Obviously, as we talked about, hits a lot of home runs. Some of that due to his excellent home run power. Some of it due to playing here in Colorado. Guy is, as I mentioned, not yet 30 years old, and he does have 308 career home runs. So given the good personality, and given the fact that on our first day on the job, ownership has already kind of put us on notice that they're not thrilled with us, which is odd, but it is what it is as far as the awkwardness of the gameplay in OOTP sometimes. But potentially signing him to an extension may be a way to win a few brownie points with ownership and also keep around a player who is good in the clubhouse, not all that great defensively, but certainly could move into a DH role from first base over the years potentially. So not completely reluctant to bring him back. We'll see what happens. Our second baseman, I guess, is kind of Jonathan Andrade. Recovering from a strained ACL at this point, hit 213 with 11 home runs. Honestly, with that infield range and the decent arm, he'd be a really good defensive third baseman. I don't know that he hits enough to play at third, but just don't know if he has enough defensive range to really feel good about playing him at second base either. I think in a perfect world, he would be a utility infielder for us. The issue is it's not a perfect world. We're taking over a new team and we're stuck with some nasty contracts, and his is definitely one of those. Making $12.9 million this year. He is signed for the next 2 years to a lower amount of $5.8 million, but for a guy that I think in a not even a perfect world, just in a rational world, is more of a bench utility player than a starting player. Not optimal to have him locked up at almost $6 million a year for the next 2 years. Willie Flores is a name that you may remember from our Kansas City Royals playthrough. A guy that I can't remember whether he was a high draft pick or a guy that an international amateur free agent. So the Royals signed him back in 2027, 21 years ago, and he had a respectable career with the Royals, but was always injured. just struggling to keep him on the field. You can see, though, that was with the Royals up until 2046, been a utility guy with Colorado the last couple years. He's a free agent. I think it's unlikely that we keep him around. We don't really have a shortstop, which is a problem. Frank De Los Santos is a youngster, 23 years old, listed as a shortstop, but with that 30 arm and that 50 range, definitely not someone I want out there on a daily basis. He's also already fragile at just 23 years old. And then Willie Trejo is a guy who was the starter this past year for the Rockies. Unfortunately, his contract is up and he's a free agent. Probably looking for pretty decent money at 33 years old. He's wrecked physically. He's certainly competent defensively. If we could bring him back at a reasonable number, would consider it. But I don't view the $14.7 million he made last year as a reasonable number, and he's headed to free agency, so I'm guessing he's looking for even more. Yeah, $16 million a year for the next 2 years. So I don't think we have a shortstop right now, and I don't think our solution at shortstop is on the roster. Third baseman Alex Smith, 28-year-old, has a pretty nice profile defensively for a third baseman, decent range, good error rating, cannon for a gun. Wouldn't mind if he was better on turn and double plays, but not the end of the world for a third baseman. Don't love the low work ethic, but he is a player who led the league in runs and doubles this past year, hitting .325. Probably not quite as good as that when you look at his batting ratings, but sometimes you have to look at what the players have done on the field. And, he's another former Royal, interestingly. And over the course of his time with Colorado, he's a .288 hitter in almost 2,000 at-bats. The only weird thing is he only has 36 home runs, so not a lot of home run power, and doesn't seem like someone who has benefited much from the high elevation and the thin air in Colorado. We'll take a look at a couple of the outfielders. Andrew Booker is a guy 24 years old from New York. Issue with him is that he's got a pretty negative personality, which if you've watched previous series with me, you know that it would be very rare for me to have a player like this on the team. You can see they picked him in the first round, 22nd overall back in 2043. I typically probably wouldn't draft a player with that type of personality that early. That said, when you look at his contact, his gap power, and his home run power, he's got some speed. He's a good bunter. Just came up this year and did hit .282 in 78 at-bats, given the fact that he's making the major league minimum, and I think he can be a pretty proficient hitter. Probably a guy that we'll keep around, even though the personality is not ideal. Emmanuel Johnson is a guy who's hit 27 homers for the Rockies each of the last 2 years. He has an $18 million contract next year, not willing to waive the no-trade clause. 35, soon to be 36-year-old who's wrecked physically. This is a contract that I would love to find a way to get out of. Don't know whether that will be possible or not, given that it says that he's not willing to waive the no-trade clause. But maybe we can find some kind of option where things will work for him. Wouldn't care if we got back anything in return. Really just want to get that contract off of the books. Right fielder Tony McDonald, 27-year-old, led the National League with 46 home runs this past year. Really good home run power, really good eye, walks a lot. Don't love the personality, don't love the defensive skills. He's a guy who's arbitration eligible, going to be making about $13.2 million. He's a guy we could move on from, and I know on a team that is somewhat devoid of talent, that seems like an interesting situation, but opening up $13 million would give us a lot more ability to kind of start getting scouting and player development the way that we want them to look. Coming off of at least 3 straight 40 home run seasons, and 3 straight since he's come up. He's, probably a player who would have some value to some teams. He's a 3-time All-Star, 2-time Silver Slugger. Don't love the personality, although he does have a good work ethic, and just think that he's getting a little bit expensive for a team that has some budgetary constraints and isn't necessarily trying to win it all next year. Maybe get some value for him before he hits free agency. Kaluste Dvorin-Chakov. I'm going to have to get rid of him just because I think I'm going to butcher the name every time I look at it. Also, don't like the low work ethic. Nice defensive outfielder, but I don't think he is a long-term member of this team. Tony Padilla is our center fielder, and I don't mind him. He's a 24-year-old. He's respectable defensively. Looks like he's respectable offensively. Came up this year and hit 252 with 10 homers and 210 at-bats. Good teammate, making the major league minimum, former number 1 first-round draft pick for us. He could be our center fielder for the next year or two until we decide which direction that we're going to go. Juan Gonzalez, right fielder, 27-year-old, making the major league minimum, still not arbitration eligible, so probably a guy we keep along. Hit just 222 last year, but did hit 33 home runs, has some speed. This massive home run power with kind of being below average everywhere else is not typically the type of batting profile that I would be drawn to in a draft or in free agency or in trade. But he's young-ish. He's cheap. And particularly if we decide that there's we can either move on from the big contract with Emmanuel Johnson or the potential high arbitration number with Tony McDonald. I don't think that Juan Gonzalez would be a bad fallback. Last among the outfielders, Min-Ho Han. Love the speed. Just don't really see him as a major league hitter, and he's 28 years old, so I could see him being a player that we decide to move on from. So that is the roster. I don't love it. I don't know if I even like it. And I want to somehow clear some salary. But as we talked about, Irizarry and Johnson are the most obvious ways to do that. And I think if they're saying here they're not willing to waive their no trade clause, just don't know if there's anything that we can do. I'm going to shop Irizarry right now and just see what we can get in terms of a prospect for him maybe. Yeah, nobody offers a single player in return, so I don't know if that's just that they know that they can't get him. Guessing it probably is. Yeah, no offers at all for him, so we are probably for the time being stuck with him, and I'm guessing it's going to be a similar situation with Johnson. So we'll send him to on the block. And I don't think he's even a bad pitcher at this point. I think he probably would be our ace next year. But at 34, soon to be 35 years old, with fragile injury proneness and making $21 million each of the next couple years, just not the type of player that I want to be building around, because by the time I think this team is ready to compete, he's going to be in his late 30s and even more if injury prone, if not the same as far as his injury proneness. So I as you probably know if you've watched me, don't tend to give no trade clauses if at all possible. Obviously, I think some of these guys are 10-5 guys, although he is actually just a pure no trade status, not willing. So I don't have a ton of experience. I'm guessing that because it says right here he's not willing to waive the no trade clause, that shopping him around isn't going to do anything. We're going to look at anything possible, and we'll even claim that we're going to retain 50% of his contract. Actually, we'll say we're going to retain 80% of his contract, and if we don't get a single offer there, then I'll officially know that when it says they're unwilling to, no offers there. So pretty clear that when we kind of look here and not willing to waive no trade clause, we're kind of stuck with them. But we are still going to put him on the block also. Would love to be able to move on from one or both of those contracts to open up some money. But in the event that it's not looking like we're going to be able to do that, then I do think we're going to look to move on from Tony McDonald. And again, this one's a little bold. Led the league in runs a year ago, led the league in home runs this past year, but he's due to make over $13 million in arbitration this year, and then $21 million the year after that. As we saw, we have some decent-ish young outfielders, but we might be able to get some value in return for him. And with the amount of money he's going to make, I'd rather get it off the books. Don't love his personality, and I don't see him being someone that we're going to sign for the long term. Could he help us next year? Absolutely. My preference would be clearly to get rid of the older Emmanuel Johnson, who's making even more money. And despite the fact that he has hit 27 homers each of the past 2 years, I think there's probably a pretty big Colorado effect there because his batting profile is pretty average-ish at best. But we're kind of stuck with him at this point. So I think we are going to shop Mr. Tony McDonald and see what type of prospects we can potentially get back. Could be a win-win, get a young prospect that we can maybe build around, and also start getting some salary off the books for next year so we can potentially start investing more heavily in our scouting and player development. So yeah, we've got a pretty good sized list of offers here. We'll take a look at them and let you know what we decide. It doesn't look like there's any stunning players available, although Alpha LeBeouf, not a horrible infield prospect, with the exception that he's really not capable of playing in the infield. And he's really not much of an outfielder either. 6 foot tall. He's a guy who doesn't really have a position. I do like his durability. I also don't love the fact that we've got low scouting accuracy with my head scout at this point. I'm not really sure what he's been doing, but he doesn't seem to have a good handle on a lot of players. So that could also be a reason to maybe wait until we get our own scout in on board. The issue is that it's going to take a new scout a lot of time to kind of scout up the majors also. Center fielder Mark Peterkin. Don't hate him. 21-year-old playing in high A ball this past year. Hit .253 with 20 homers. Looks like a decent defensive outfielder. Has some speed. Looks like he could be a competent major league hitter. Wouldn't necessarily be a horrible bat in Colorado either, with the fact that looks like he's probably going to have plus home run power and a good eye if he completely develops. Don't hate him as a prospect, but we'll spend some more time going through all of these guys and let you know what we decide. And honestly, I don't love any of the offers that we have for McDonald, but I do feel like it's the only option to take a decent chunk of salary off the books and also get a personality that I don't love off the team. Those of you who have watched previous episodes, particularly if you watched the early stages of the Pittsburgh episode after I moved on from Kansas City, know that I have a tendency to end up, when I take over a new team, bringing on a lot of players that I know from my previous organizations, in addition to Peterkin, who we talked about, Victor Marakin, who was a international free agent signing with Pittsburgh, who we traded away several years ago, is not a great prospect. But as I talked about, we don't really have a shortstop for next year, and he's not an ideal shortstop, but he at least could play a competent major league shortstop for us defensively, and it doesn't look like he's got a horrible bat. If I could get Marroquin and Peterkin, I'd be interested in that. The other guy that I did look at was Mario Alvarez. Similar again, not a great defensive shortstop, although I think he is better than Marroquin. Nice personality. He's just not really a major league hitter. Hit 219 in AAA last year and a buck 84 and a cup of coffee with Milwaukee at the end of the previous season. But he's durable, and he's a guy that you could put out there every day who would at least not embarrass you defensively. But if there's a way for me to get Marroquin and Peterkin, I think that is probably the direction that we will go. And they won't do the deal straight up for both of those players. Marroquin, who would give us some optionality in the middle infield for the next couple of years, and then Peterkin, who could be a useful outfielder for us down the line. There's actually a pretty decent list of players that could make the deal work. So I may just use this as an opportunity to start cleaning out some personalities that I don't like from our system to get this deal done. And we can get the deal done if we add in the 24-year-old right-handed pitcher Gabe Ambris. He's a replacement level reliever, low adaptability, an extreme fly ball pitcher with only throws in the low to mid 90s and has below average movement on his pitches. I just think this guy is going to be a disaster if he ever gets up to Colorado. He's only in Double-A at this point, but he certainly doesn't have the profile that I think is going to make him successful. We'll still try to get a little more. Ooh, I just handed it a random player and they went for it. I guess I got to be more careful than that. Looking more at the prospects. We'll always try to get a little bit more. And again, I get the point that trading away a guy who just led the National League in home runs at 27 years old isn't the right decision for next year. But as I talked about, we're in a bit of a tough situation where the two contracts that I really want to get rid of both have no trade clauses and I can't get rid of them. This is one of the guys that I can get rid of, who's going to be probably the fourth highest paid player on our team next year. And he's going to be making over $20 million the year after that. And then he's a free agent. And I don't like his personality, and I kind of want him out of the clubhouse. So I would think that I could get a little more for a player with that talent. But again, Marroquin is a respectable major league player. In a perfect world, he's a backup middle infielder for us. It's possible he's a starting shortstop next year. And then Peterkin looks like a guy who could contribute at the major league level. He could be a starting outfielder for us with that speed and potentially plus contact, gap power, home run power, and a decent eye. Competent defensively. Former fourth round pick is... These guys aren't as good as McDonald, but they're decent players, decent prospects, and more importantly, they're a lot less expensive. All right, and we've actually pieced something together that I feel even better about. We got $8 million in cash coming back from the Astros, which will certainly help us. And then we were also able to get them to put in, since we had put in Ambris, closer prospect Victor Duque, 19-year-old, good personality. I do worry that his lack of movement is a potential problem in Colorado down the line. He is a ground ball pitcher, which hopefully mitigates that a bit. but he's a durable left-handed pitcher, good personality. Think that he's a guy we could potentially flip down the line and get some value for if we decide that he is not the right fit in Colorado, given the lack of movement on his pitches. So I know some people may disagree with getting rid of the most talented player in the trade in Tony McDonald, but those of you who have watched me know that I don't like bad personalities on my team. And more importantly, as I was talking about, we've got to find a way to open up some cash. And looking at the salary situation next year, Erzeri and Johnson won't move on. And Jamal Cohen is a guy that ownership wants us to re-sign, who's also a productive offensive player with a much better personality. So when I look at who's going to be making a lot of money next year, McDonald is going to be fourth on the team in salary. And as I said, we need to open up some money for scouting and development. And moving on from Mr. McDonald is the most obvious way to do that I can think of. So we are going to go ahead, and I know that also I'm going a little blind here with the poor scouting that I have. I totally get that. But I just want to get the salary that I can get off our books right now, start bringing some players with personalities that are less objectionable, or in the case of Duque, actually positive into the organization. And I don't think it's horrible talent. Duque could be a useful pitcher, just might not be in Colorado. Peterkin, I think, can be a useful outfielder. And as we talked about, Marroquin right now could be our starting shortstop next year. Again, not ideal, but better than the nothing that we have for shortstop at this point. So we're going to go ahead and complete that trade. Fans not happy that we moved on from McDonald, so probably not the best sign in the world to start hitting fan interest in a negative direction first day on the job. But you can see now we've got some money for free agents. Don't know where we're going to end up with scouting and development, but going to start getting at least some placeholders into those budgets that are not where we necessarily want them to be, but are certainly more respectable than the levels that the Rockies were at last year. Also looking at player development, we need to put more money into the draft also potentially. And they also didn't have a lot in their international amateur free agent budget. Yeah, we're using up all of the money that we just opened up from making that trade, just in terms of trying to build our farm system. And we're still not going to be where we want to be yet, because we'd love to have a full $5 million available for international amateur free agents. But we're at the point now where we can't even get to that number. So we've taken some talent off of the team, but I feel like we got cash back in return. We got some not great prospects, but respectable prospects and useful potential players back in return. And as I said, we opened up the money to really hopefully help fix our scouting and development. Also looking at ticket prices and the fact that fan interest is going in a wrong direction, I think we may consider cutting those significantly, potentially for next year. Have more time to think about this till we get to the Rule 5 draft. But I don't like seeing a ton of empty seats. Again, it's a big stadium in Colorado. So from that perspective, we still were averaging almost 29,000 a game, making almost 900,000 a game. But I'm going to be a little conservative and tentatively cut the ticket price to $26 next year, which would be a 17% decrease. Hopefully that we can get some more fans into the seats, because increasing attendance over the next couple of years is one of our goals. And again, I don't want to get obsessed with those owner goals, and in some cases they can be contradictory to actually making more money. We could drop the ticket price down to $10, and then we could easily hit that attendance goal. But we're going to be generating a lot less revenue per game if we do that. So it's definitely a situation where we're trying to find the best compromise and the best middle ground in terms of some of the decisions that we're making. And before we make too many other moves as far as the players, do want to kind of figure out scouting and training. And we are going to have to at some point make offers to a manager, a bench coach, a third base coach, and all of those vacancies that we have in the minor leagues. And today, the first day of the off season, is going to be the best talent pool that's available. So we're going to spend some time on all of that stuff. And then we've also got to kind of take a look at the existing coaches on our team and whether we want to keep them around. Our pitching coach, decent at teaching pitching, decent at development, average at mechanics. Certainly wouldn't mind moving on from him. Hitting coach, Edgar Pineda. He's better. Legendary at teaching, hitting, outstanding with aging, good with development, excellent with mechanics. No real need to move on from him, but could definitely see us looking to upgrade at pitching coach, either promoting a star that we have in the minors or finding someone available. But as I said, trainer and scouting and whether there's some options there that are better than what we have are the first look. Again, an average team trainer across the board isn't ideal, but we're also a team that is probably not really competing for a playoff spot next year. So unless there's a real star out there, having someone who's competent at just about everything, a little better at fatigue recovery, a little worse at rehabbing arm injuries, might not be the worst spot for us to be in, particularly since he's signed through 2052. So it's going to be a little more expensive to move on from him, but we're going to at least see what's available. And not surprisingly, a lot of the big-time trainers who already have jobs don't want to move on to something new. But I did find Ozzie Cedillo here, who's certainly an upgrade. He's average at rehabbing leg injuries, so that's where our current trainer is. And you can see he's better at everything else. I usually try to find trainers who are most strong at preventing arm injuries. There weren't necessarily any great options out there who were as well balanced as Cedillo, but for a 37-year-old who's kind of average or better at everything, and outstanding at rehabbing arm injuries in the case that, that's the thing that he's kind of weakest at in terms of preventing, also excellent at fatigue recovery. This is a guy who would clearly be a big upgrade for us at trainer. So we're going to go ahead and offer a contract to him. He's only looking for $275,000 a year for 3 years. We're going to actually see if always trying to save money. We're going to see if we can get him for a little less than that, but also for more years than that at 5 years. We will have to pay out Lee, who was signed for several years, as we talked about. But this is just such a good upgrade and a 37-year-old that theoretically we may be able to keep around through this entire rebuild of the Rockies. I think it makes sense to get an offer out to Ozzie Cedillo to potentially become our new trainer. And those of you who have either watched my tutorial on building a coaching staff or have just kind of seen me build other teams in the past will know that one thing that I am typically very focused on is the cohesion of the staff and everybody getting along and checking out the personalities before I hire people. Quite honestly, this is a total rebuild. I am going to bring on a scouting director and a team trainer that are the best available and guys that I like. And you can see that actually those are the two guys that there are some problems with right now with the guys that are currently in there. And the easygoing personality of trainer Ozzie Cedillo is going to be a problem, but the guy that it's going to be a problem with is the pitching coach, Joseph Parsons, who we are likely to replace and fire very shortly. So right now, I am just focused on. I think I found a really good trainer. Want to hopefully also find a really good scouting director, and if there's some conflicts between those two guys, we'll deal with it if they're both incredibly talented. And then the next big job is going to be to find a manager. And once we find those three guys, we can kind of build the rest of the coaching staff in a way that will hopefully have improved cohesion and people getting along together. But right now, I just want to upgrade the talent of our coaching staff, and not going to be totally focused on personalities, because right now I just need some producers in those roles. And there are some scouts out there that are interesting, headed by our former scout in Pittsburgh, Jorgen Cavanario. And I know that some of you have commented on this, the favor tools versus the highly favored tools debate. And there's many out there. And I think that Sergeant Mushroom in his YouTube videos have explained it better than most as to the huge value of a highly favored tools scout. You can see that with Pittsburgh, I was going with a favor tools scout. Would love a highly favored tools guy if at all possible. But I've talked about in previous episodes that I think international scouting is kind of the one area where you can really differentiate yourself to the better if you've got a scout that's great at international scouting and you also invest a lot of money into your scouting budget, and then you invest a good chunk of that scouting budget in international scouting. That's kind of the one area where you can really differentiate your team by bringing on talent through scouting discoveries and high-level talent at times through scouting discoveries that you're just not going to get anywhere else. Which is why, I mean, he's obviously legendary or outstanding in anything, which is why, even though he's not highly favored tools, I've had him for the entire 11-year run with the Pittsburgh Pirates when I found him. So certainly, Daeyu Kim out of Korea is a guy who's legendary with international, outstanding in the majors and minors, and excellent with amateurs, who's a favor tools guy. He would certainly be the top candidate with that legendary skill. If I decide to go to a highly favored tools guy, it's Alex Delgado out of Venezuela, who's excellent in the majors, minors, and international, and outstanding with amateurs. So still an incredibly talented scout with international players, and does have that highly favored tools ability. He's better than Kim in terms of amateurs, which is important, outstanding versus excellent. But you can see that Kim is better than him, Delgado, in all of the other three categories. But given that he is a highly favored tools guy and the most talented highly favored tools guy that's out there, we're going to see if we can make an offer to Mr. Delgado to join our team as our new scout. 3 years, $735,000. As we talked about, Flores is in his last year. We're going to see if we can get him for $650,000 a year for 5 years. Once again, lock up a guy that we like, and hopefully get him signed for the medium to long term. Not as young as the potential trainer who's in his late 30s, but still a player, or still a coach in his late 50s who could definitely be with us for a decade as our scouting director. And looking at Delgado as the potential scouting director, no red flags as far as his personality with the guys that are on staff right now. But again, that is not critical because we know Parsons is going to be gone. Wouldn't mind keeping Pineda around as a hitting coach, and first base coach JT Realmuto. Outstanding at in-game running, pretty good at coaching and teaching So I think he's a guy that we would keep around also. He's a pretty good first base coach. The main thing to care about with the base coaches is their in-game running ability, and then are they really good at teaching some type of defense or running. And Real Munto's pretty solid at all of that, and certainly respectable in the other categories. So I think he's a guy that we will look to keep around also. So we're going to need a pitching coach. But right now, question is who our manager is going to be next year. We'll take a look at free agents that are out there, and also take a look through our minor league system and get an offer out to a manager, and then we will probably call it an episode, since we've been talking for a long time now, even though we haven't actually moved forward a day. A lot of work to do and a lot of things to think about when you take over a new organization and a rebuild. And there were no obvious frontline great manager prospects within our system, so we are going to go to the free agent market and see who's available. There's only 30 manager jobs in all of Major League Baseball, so you would think we can probably hopefully have some good prospects out there. And the main things I care about when looking for a manager are player development, influencing mechanics, and people that can handle aging. And then I will also look at relationships and how they're expected to get along with players on the team. That's very important also. We'll check in on the personality in this case, just to make sure if I find someone who I think is a right candidate, not going to be a huge conflict with our potential new scouting director and team trainer. But the scouting director in particular, who's on the road a lot, I don't think that conflicts there are as big a potential issue as someone who's going to be around every day. So certainly Nick Hartman stands out to me. Legendary with development, outstanding with mechanics, and still good with handling aging. He's got a decent reputation, and he's expected to have good relationships with the Rockies players. I don't want to simplify things too much, especially for someone who's never managed before, but you look at the ratings he had. Actually, he was the manager from the Mariners over a decade ago, and he's been out. Actually made the playoffs 5 times in 7 years as the manager of the Mariners. So he's got a decent track record, but he's been out so much that he's going to kind of let me build the staff, which is my preference. I tell you, with those relationships being good, and the fact that he is, as I said, legendary with development, outstanding with mechanics, and good with aging, only question is the personality stuff. So he's normal, works well with controlling, and he struggles with easygoing. The easygoing guy that he would struggle with is the pitching coach that we're going to get rid of. Works well with controlling, which we don't have. And he's normal. So I don't see any real big conflicts there. And again, he's the manager. And I think he's a pretty talented manager prospect. So we would definitely be inclined to build things around him rather than somebody else. If we have to move people to get him on board, I think we'd be willing to do it. But it doesn't seem like there's any huge issues there. So we're going to see if we can make an offer to Nick Hartman to join us. Looking for $1.5 million a year for 5 years. So he knows his value. He knows he's got some skill, or he's got some talent in the areas that are important. We'll see if maybe $1.25 million for 5 years. You have been on the beach for well over a decade at this point, Mr. Hartman. We'll submit that offer to him. So we've got the offer out to Hartman. Again, taking a look at the potential staff roles. our potential new manager and our potential new trainer both potentially have conflicts with our pitching coach, but we're going to be moving on from that pitching coach in very short order. So not an issue at all. Obviously would love to start filling in some of the other spots, bench coach, third base coach, and potentially pitching coach with people that are not just good at their job, but also will work well with the personalities that we've put together at this point. And you can see we're kind of focused right now on normal, personable, and temperamental. And if we keep Pineda and Real Munto, those guys are normal and temperamental also. So not the worst situation in the world where we basically only got 3 personality types. So hopefully we can find some synergies as we flesh out the rest of the staff. But if we can bring on this manager, scouting director, and team trainer, I think we'll have made some big strides in terms of improving the management at the major league level of this organization. So I know I've talked a lot and we've covered a lot and we've met the team a little, and we've made one big trade and done a lot of things. And as I said, we haven't even moved forward a day. But that's kind of the nature of the beast when you take over a new team. I don't want this episode to be exceedingly long. So I am going to call it an episode shortly. We'll probably look to fill the rest of the coach roles and make those offers offline. Not going to subject you to all of that decision making across the organization. But I think I'll probably do that offline before our next episode. But still may be on October 25th when we jump back in. But if we can get the coaching staff figured out throughout the organization in the next week or so, then we can really turn to the players. And, some of these guys we're going to want to make arbitration offers to. Some of them we are not. So that is another way to free up some money. Although obviously with the trade of McDonald, with his potential $13 million arbitration number, that was the obvious move that we could make that would potentially free up the money that we freed up. But I think there's still probably some levers to press with some of those players. I'm guessing as I dig in deeper with some of them, they're not going to be guys that we necessarily want to build around for the long term. And you can see we can be saving $1.5 million to $3.5, $4 million, close to $5 million with some of them if we decide to move on. So that will potentially give us a little bit more flexibility in the budget going forward for next season if we do move on from some of those players. And then obviously would love it if those 2 players that I was talking about earlier, Mr. Irizarry and or Johnson, decide that they are willing to at some point move away from the clean, crisp air in Colorado and continue their careers somewhere else. So we've got them on the trade block. Don't think that that's necessarily something that's going to happen overnight, but clearly moving on from those guys would give us a lot more financial flexibility for next year. Don't know if it's going to be possible or not. At least Johnson will be gone after next year, and then Irizarry the season after that. So not real long-term big commitments. So we're going to be freeing up some money. And again, we're not necessarily focused on trying to compete next year. We're really more interested in starting to build a foundation through bringing on some of the young talent, which we did in the first trade, and then also ultimately building an organization that invests more in scouting and development, and hopefully turning around this mediocre farm system to being something that really fuels the trajectory in a positive direction of the Colorado Rockies over the coming years. So that is the goal, that is the plan, and we'll talk about it a lot more in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.